Maybe you've noticed that Joe Biden has been picking up some union endorsements lately. At least that's what you're supposed to believe, I guess. Mark Mix is the president of the National Right to Work Committee, and he joins us now with something that might be the other side of the story. Thanks for coming on, Mark. I appreciate it.
John, it's good to be on with you. Thanks for the opportunity. And you're right. I mean, the United Auto Workers Union delivered a coveted endorsement of Joe Biden about 2 weeks ago. This endorsement was decided by 14 members of the executive committee of the UAW. But what the interesting twist was that when Shawn Fain, the new president of the United Auto Workers Union, was on TV shortly after the endorsement, he said, and I quote, "Let me be clear, a great majority of our members are not going to be voting for Joe Biden. They're going to be voting their paycheck." So from that quote, one wonders whether he made a Freudian slip and said something out loud that he wasn't supposed to, or just made a mistake. The bottom line is this. It indicates a problem where there is a growing disconnect between union officials and rank-and-file workers. And I think this is another example of that. And certainly we have other examples that will probably be in the news sooner rather than later when it comes to these endorsements.
Yeah, see, I guess I'm crazy, but I used to think that when a union boss announced his endorsement of a candidate, you make the assumption that the union boss at least has, if he doesn't have his finger on the pulse of the workers, somebody does, and they before they make an endorsement or announce one, they actually have some reason to believe that the union agrees with what or with whom they're about to endorse, but that's not the case, apparently.
Yeah, one would hope, John, that would be the case, but I don't think that is. You know, while union officials call themselves the most democratic institutions in America, what we do know about the UAW is that it wasn't until just about 2 years ago when they had a major federal investigation of corruption in the highest ranks of the union, going up to the president, where two of their past presidents went to jail for felony extortion and racketeering. It wasn't until then they were under federal oversight, they still are for another 4 years, that they actually had elections by members of the leadership of the union. And still, when it comes to these endorsement processes, as I understand it, as the Washington Post reported it, the 14 members of the UAW Executive Committee made this decision. And like you, John, I would assume that they talked to some members, but when you have the president coming out and saying, "Let me be clear, a great majority of our members will not be voting for Joe Biden, the candidate we just endorsed," one has to wonder.
Well, how common do you think that is?
I think it's very common. I mean, when you look at the leadership of the unions and where they stand politically and ideologically, I think there's a great disconnect between the workers. And that's why the Teamsters Union right now is withholding their endorsement, and they're kind of playing footsies with Donald Trump, because I think Sean O'Brien, the new president of the Teamster Union, understands that a large number of his rank-and-file, quote-unquote, members will be supporting Donald Trump when it comes to this next election. And Joe Biden really hasn't helped them as much. I mean, if you look at the stories around the Teamsters, other than their pensions being bailed out by taxpayer money, the fact that 22,000 yellow freight truck drivers who were Teamster members were basically thrown under the bus by Sean O'Brien, the Teamster president, one wonders. And I think, in my experience in working with unions, I grew up in a union household myself, an International Association machinist stepfather for 32 years, and I can tell you he didn't support the candidate that his union endorsed year after year. I'm sure of that.
Well, and aren't their dues often taken and used to contribute to these candidates whom they do not endorse?
They absolutely are, John. And that's one of the cases that we litigated back in 1988. Believe it or not, we won a U.S. Supreme Court case, our Legal Defense Foundation, called Beck versus Communication Workers of America. And it basically said that while you were a member of the union, your money would be used for political causes and other ideological causes because you were, quote, voluntarily a member of the union. Well, interestingly enough, back to 1963 in a case called General Motors, the Supreme Court ruled that you didn't have to be a formal member of the union, meaning a formal membership member of a union, but you could still be compelled to pay up to 100% of dues or fees. In our case in 1988, we said, look, you can't continue to force these people to pay for political or ideological causes that have nothing to do with the workplace and the terms and conditions of their employment. And the Supreme Court agreed with us in that case. But the problem was, John, was that in order to exercise those rights and withhold your political money, you had to give up your workplace rights, because once you became a non-member, still required to pay dues or fees to keep your job, You couldn't vote on the union contract. You couldn't vote in union elections. You couldn't participate in negotiations of the contract and the conditions of your employment. So in order to protect your political rights, you had to give up your workplace rights. In order to protect your workplace rights, you had to give up your political rights. So today, if you're a member of a union, even though notwithstanding the fact that you would oppose what the union's doing with your money, pretty much that money goes in to support candidates you may disagree with or causes you may disagree with, surely.
What's the numbers for union membership in the country right now?
John,
what's
the numbers
do you have a
for
percentage?
2023? Yeah, the numbers just came out in 2023, and literally after all of the kind of media attention about this dramatic push in union organizing, the union density in the private sector actually went down. They represent about 6% of the private sector workforce today, about 10% of the entire workforce when you add in public sector workers. So their numbers have stayed relatively the same. The AFL-CIO, which is the umbrella of, I think, 56 independent unions now, has about 14 million members, and that's almost equally divided, John, between 7 million public sector government workers that are part of a union and about 7 million private sector workers that are part of a union.
So 6%, that surprises me. What was in the heyday of the unions? What were the numbers like?
Well, in 1955, I think, was kind of the apex year for union density. That was about 35% of the private sector workforce at that time. Of course, at that point, public sector workers weren't unionized. It wasn't until 1959 when Wisconsin introduced the concept of government workers' unions in their state, and then John F. Kennedy signed an executive order in 1962 basically allowing unionization of federal employees is when that took off. But 55 was the apex at about 35% of the private sector. Was
that a good thing? Allowing government workers to unionize?
Well, not according to Franklin Roosevelt. When he was asked about it in 1937, when the Supreme Court upheld the federal imposition of unionism across the entire country on all 50 states, he said something like, it's unconscionable that we would organize the public sector. It's just not the same as the private sector because the public sector provides necessary services and they're a monopoly. And the worst thing you want to do is give monopoly power to a private organization over what is perceived and probably as operationally a monopoly, i.e. government. So Franklin Roosevelt thought it was a bad idea, and I think most taxpayers probably think it's a bad idea now, too.
Yeah. We're talking to Mark Mix. He's president of the National Right to Work Committee. Mark, can you just kind of explain what right-to-work laws are and why they're necessary?
Yeah, John, it's really a simple concept. Back in the 1930s, during the Roosevelt administration, the federal government passed what is known as the National Labor Relations Act. There's a couple pieces to it, but today it's known as the National Labor Relations Act. That federal law imposed forced unionism on the entire country. It basically said that unions were allowed to negotiate contracts that said you had to be a formal member of a union back then, and you had to pay dues to the union in order to get or keep a job in America. So that federal power spreads out across the country. From 1937, when the Supreme Court upheld this Wagner Act, this federal imposition of forced unionism, when President Roosevelt threatened to pack the court with 6 new justices, but that's a whole other story, John. In 1946, the Congress came back in, and in 1947, they passed a reform to the National Labor Relations Act called the Taft-Hartley Act, and they allowed states, if they could, by affirmative vote, to pass what are known as right-to-work laws to outlaw the closed-shop forced unionism that was imposed by the federal government in 1935. And so since then, and since 1947, 26 states, well, actually 27 states have passed right-to-work laws saying that, look, you can join a union, you can associate with a union, you can give your entire paycheck to a union if you choose to do so, but you can't lose your job in a state that's passed a right-to-work law if you decide you don't want to be part of the union. And that's really how simple it is. Right-to-work laws just simply say, look, you have the choice, and union officials cannot negotiate contracts that say you must be a member and you must pay dues.
Yeah, I was a member of a union. I was a member of AFTRA as a radio TV performer, and I also was a member of a union when I worked for a local supermarket chain. And in both cases, if I did not join the union, I couldn't work there.
That's right. And that's the power of organized labor. And believe it or not, John, there are private sector organizations been granted that power, that privilege by the federal government. And the only way you can roll it back is to use the little window of opportunity that states have to preempt federal law, because, the preemption doctrine, basically the federal law rules and the states can't tinker with it. But in this case, Congress realized after what would have been an exponential growth in unions and unfortunately an exponential growth in labor union disputes, strikes, from 1937 to the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, there were literally millions and millions and millions of people on strike across the country. John L. Lewis was leveraging the coal mining union to put power on the government about, hey, you don't get your coal unless you concede to our demands. Walter Reuther with the United Auto Workers in 1937, with the sit-down strike in Flint. I mean, literally, people got really tired of the shutdowns and the strikes that were fomented by this power that union officials had. And so that's why 47, the Taft-Hartley Act passes. And to this day, unions still have that compulsory unions in power in Pennsylvania and 23 other states across America.
So it still exists here in Pennsylvania.
Unfortunately.
I benefited, I have to say, from membership in AFTRA. I saw also unbelievably stupid results from the various unions that were involved in the shops I worked in, the TV stations that I worked for. But for me, for example, I got a great severance package that was a result of being in AFTRA, and I'm glad I had it, and I was almost to the point where it was worth being in the union. But what if, and Pennsylvania doesn't have the right to work law, so what about someone who doesn't want to be a member of the union in a shop where there is a union? He can't benefit from what the union has negotiated, correct? Or has no right to claim it?
Yeah, well, no, and that's an interesting point, and that's one of the provisions union officials talk about all the time, is that somehow these people that don't want to support their political causes, their ideological causes, somehow benefit from the union. Well, let's first of all establish that the unions are the exclusive bargaining agent in the workplace once the union is located there. That means that you, John, can't talk to your boss about a pay raise or talk about extra work or talk about, any kind of conditions of employment that would be negotiated by the union. The union has to do that. So they become the spokesman for all employees in the workplace. And the notion that everything that unions do benefits every worker is really laid aside when you think about the seniority rules or the step pay rules or the seniority rules that exist in a workplace that says, okay, if we got to lay off people, we have to lay off, even though the worker that's been there 5 years may be a much better productive or much better and more productive worker than someone that's been there for 25, the guy with 5 years has got to go before the guy with 25. So if it does benefit you, and that's what unions, that should be their value proposition. They should be doing things like they did for you in negotiating these severance packages and saying, hey, look, we're more focused on the workplace and your future and your current, where you are today than we are on who's elected in Harrisburg or who's elected in Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, because they have this compulsory power that comes with the ability to extract forced dues or fees from you, and then to force you to associate with them and block you from having a conversation with your employer, those are the types of powers that sometimes, and I think in many instances, workers would say, don't benefit me. But the union is the sole exclusive voice in the workplace. So, when they say workers are getting all the benefits, I would say, well, first of all, what is a benefit? And secondly, there's no way that an individual employee can do anything on their own in a unionized environment. So it's really a stacked deck, if you will, when it comes to individual employee rights and freedoms.
Would it be fair to say that unions are a good idea, but the concept has been abused?
I say this, John. I say that people always say, well, there was a place for unions. I agree with that. I believe that there is a place for unions, and I believe there will be a place for unions in the workplace, because any time that an employer abuses, the employees or doesn't treat them well, there is a rationale for employees to join together to amplify their voice. The problem is that unions, since they got a taste of government power with the passage of the Railway Labor Act back in 1926, they have gone to government for a dramatic expansion of their power across the American workplace. And I would say this: if they were more interested in the shop floor than they were in the steps of the capitals around the country, people would join them voluntarily. But because they have this compulsory unions in power, and because their power is a derivative of government action, they tend to not pay attention to workers. I grew up in a union household, as I mentioned, 32-year member of the Machinists Union. And I got to tell you that there were things the unions did that my stepfather disagreed with. He was a welder, and he understood their power, and he understood their role in the workplace. But they had the sole voice. And so when they said you got to go out on strike, they walked out. When they said they had to do this, they did that. And sometimes a lot of people disagree with them. So I say there is, and there will be a place for unions, but there's no place for compulsion or force in that recipe.
And how common is the issue of the force being a problem?
Yeah,
how big of a fight is it?
Union. Yeah, in almost every union contract in a non-right-to-work state like Pennsylvania, one of the first provisions of every contract, and if you pull out your after contract or your United Food and Commercial Workers contract from your grocery store days, you'll find that the very first two clauses of the contract will be what's called union security. And that union security language goes something like this: that every employee that comes to work for this company or this grocery store or this radio station is required within 30 days to join the union and have dues extracted from their paycheck as a condition of their employment. If after 30 days the worker does not agree to pay the union dues or, quote, join the union, it usually has membership language too, which is illegal under the 1963 Supreme Court case that we talked about. You have to be a formal member. That's illegal. But they say you must be a member of the union and you must pay dues. And if you don't, you lose your job. I would say in 90% of the contracts in non-right-to-work states like Pennsylvania, that language will be the first or second section of every contract. In right-to-work states, that language, that union security language, and that's exactly what it is. It's security for the union, not for the worker. That language can't exist in a contract in a right-to-work state.
Well, I'm out of time, Mark, but I appreciate you clearing that up, and everybody should pay close attention to what are perceived to be or expected to be perceived as union endorsements of various candidates. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, that's Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Committee. I'll be right back.